Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where forgotten civilizations, unexplained wonders, and ancient secrets come back to life. Ready to unravel the mystery? Let's begin the journey. The boundary between the human world and the wild is often thought to be a solid wall. But history holds forgotten stories that challenge this idea, revealing our deep connection to nature. The case of Marina Chapman, a woman who claims she was abandoned in the Colombian jungle and raised by monkeys, is one of the most stunning examples. Her journey is a powerful testament to human adaptability. The story of Marina Chapman does not begin with a grand adventure or a brave choice. It begins, as so many nightmares do, in the quiet light of an ordinary day. In a small village in Colombia, a little girl, no more than 4 years old, was playing in the garden behind her home. She was wearing a simple black dress with small white polka dots, a dress her mother had made for her. The world for her was a small and simple place, defined by the familiar scent of flowers, the warmth of the sun on her skin, and the comforting sound of her family's voices nearby. In one moment, this world was everything she knew. In the next, it was gone forever. A hand, rough and smelling of something strange and sweet, clamped hard over her mouth. Her small gasp was swallowed by a thick cloth pressed against her face. She felt a brief, dizzying sensation, like the world was spinning away from her, and then a profound darkness. She was lifted, her small legs kicking against nothing, and carried away from the sunlit garden. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of being bundled into a tight, dark space. The rough floor of a truck scratching against her arms. The comforting sounds of home were replaced by the roar of an engine and the muffled, urgent voices of strangers. For a child so young, the concept of a kidnapping is impossible to grasp. In her confused, half-conscious state, she couldn't understand what was happening. Was this a game? Where were they going? The journey was a blur of darkness, bumps, and fear. Time lost all meaning. Could have been hours or it could have been days. When the truck finally lurched to a stop, the sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. The back doors were thrown open, and for a moment, a blinding wall of green light assaulted her eyes. She was pulled out, not gently but dragged and then pushed, tumbling onto the damp, unfamiliar earth. She scrambled to her feet, her little dress torn and stained with dirt, just in time to see the truck turn around and drive away. The sound of its engine grew fainter and fainter, until it was completely swallowed by the immense, living silence of the jungle. And then there was nothing. She was alone. This was not the quiet of her village at night. This was a different kind of silence, one that was filled with a million tiny, unknown sounds. The hum of insects, the distant cry of a strange bird, the rustle of leaves in a canopy so thick it blocked out the sky. For the first few moments, shock kept her frozen in place. She stood where she had been left, expecting the truck to come back. She expected her mother or father to appear from behind a tree, to tell her the scary game was over. She called out, her small voice sounding tiny and lost in the vastness. "Mama!" The word was absorbed by the leaves, and the only answer was the relentless hum of the jungle. She called again, louder this time, her voice cracking with the first wave of real undiluted terror. No one answered. No one came. As the first day wore on, her world shrank to the small clearing where she had been abandoned. The sun, which she could only see in fractured patches through the thick ceiling of leaves, began to dip lower. The colors of the jungle shifted from vibrant green to deep, shadowy blues. With the coming of darkness, a new kind of fear took hold. The sounds of the day were replaced by the sounds of the night, hoots, clicks, and deep growls that seemed to come from every direction at once. Every shadow seemed to move, to twist into the shape of a monster. She found the largest tree she could and huddled at its base, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. She closed her eyes, but she couldn't shut out the sounds. Sleep was impossible. She was a small, terrified child, waiting for a dawn that felt like it would never arrive. When the light finally did return, it brought no comfort, only a new, more urgent problem. A gnawing, agonizing hunger. In her old life, food simply appeared. Now her stomach twisted into a painful knot. Thirst soon followed, a dry, scratchy feeling in her throat that made it hard to swallow. The jungle, which had been a place of fear, now became a place of false promises. Everything was green and looked alive. She saw bright red berries and plucked one, but its smell was bitter and strange. Instinct, a deep and ancient part of her that she didn't know she possessed, told her not to eat it. She tried chewing on a leaf, but it was tough and tasted like dirt. She was surrounded by life, yet she was starving. The second day was a blur of misery. She wandered aimlessly, her small legs getting scratched by thorns and bitten by insects. The hope that had kept her going on the first day began to curdle into despair. The belief that her parents were looking for her, that they would find her soon, started to feel like a fantasy. The jungle was too big, too dense. How could anyone ever find one little girl in a place like this? She cried until she had no more tears left, her sobs turning into dry, hitched breaths. The world was no longer a place of family and gardens. It was an enemy, a green monster that was slowly trying to swallow her whole. By the third day, a profound change began to take place. The sharp edges of her fear and hunger started to dull, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. She stopped calling for her mother. She stopped looking for a path. Her human world, with its memories of a warm bed and full meals, was fading, becoming as distant and unreal as a dream. Her reality was now the damp earth, the constant buzzing of insects, and the relentless pain in her belly. Her body, which had been fighting so hard, began to give up. She was too weak to walk far, so she crawled, her small hands sinking into the mud. She found a small hollow, a place where the roots of a giant tree created a natural shelter, and collapsed into it. This was the lowest point. Lying there on the forest floor, her little black and white dress now a tattered brown rag, she felt a strange sense of calm. The struggle was over. She had no more energy to be scared, no more will to be hungry. She closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the jungle one last time. She was just a small, forgotten thing, about to be reclaimed by the earth. She was waiting to die. It was in this moment of absolute surrender, when all hope was extinguished, that her world changed once again. It started with a sound, not the threatening growl of a predator or the shriek of a bird, but a series of light, chattering noises. It was close. She opened her eyes, her vision blurry with weakness. Above her, in the branches of the tree, were figures. They were small and quick, with long tails and curious faces. They were a family, a troop of capuchin monkeys, their white faces and dark fur standing out against the green leaves. At first, she felt a familiar spike of fear. Were they another danger? She lay perfectly still, trying not to breathe, hoping they hadn't seen her. But they had. They stopped their playing and grooming and stared down at her, their heads cocked to the side. They chattered to one another, a complex language of clicks and calls that she couldn't understand. She was just a strange, motionless lump on the ground to them. One of the monkeys, smaller and braver than the rest, shimmied down the tree trunk for a closer look. It stopped a few feet away, its dark, intelligent eyes blinking at her. It didn't seem aggressive. Just seemed curious. Marina watched, too weak to move. The monkey crept closer, sniffed the air around her, and then scampered back up the tree to rejoin its family. She thought that was the end of it, that they would move on and leave her to her fate. But they stayed. They watched her for what felt like hours, a silent audience to her slow decline. The terrible thirst was now a burning fire in her throat. She whimpered a small animal sound. And then something incredible happened. An older monkey, one that seemed to be the leader, slowly made its way down the tree. It approached her cautiously. It didn't touch her, but it made a soft chattering sound and then turned and walked a few paces away, looking back at her. Did this again. It was a gesture, an invitation. With the last ounce of strength she possessed, She pushed herself up and crawled after it. The monkey led her through the undergrowth, not far, to a small hollow in a log that was filled with murky brown rainwater. To her it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She plunged her face into it and drank, the cool liquid soothing the fire in her throat. The monkey watched her, patient and silent. It had saved her life. This single act of guidance was the beginning. As she regained a sliver of strength, she continued to watch the troop. She saw them foraging, pulling down branches to get at small, hard-shelled fruits. They would expertly crack them open and eat the contents, dropping the empty shells and half-eaten pieces to the forest floor. Hunger drove her to crawl over to where the scraps had fallen. She picked one up. It smelled sweet. She copied them using a rock to break it open, and ate the small piece of fruit inside. It was the first real food she had tasted in days, and it was a revelation. The monkeys had not given her food, but they had shown her how to find it. They had given her a lesson in survival. She began to follow them, a small two-legged shadow trailing behind the chattering troop. They didn't fully accept her, not yet. She was still an outsider, a strange and slow creature. But they tolerated her presence. They allowed her to watch, to learn. In those first few days of this new bizarre existence, a profound shift occurred. The jungle was no longer just an enemy trying to kill her. It was still a dangerous and terrifying place, but now it held a possibility. The monkeys, with their strange language and secret knowledge, represented a path forward. She was no longer Marina, the little girl from the village. She was a creature of the forest, learning a new set of rules from a new kind of family. The nightmare of her abandonment was not over, but it was transforming into something else entirely. A strange, unbelievable story of survival, a journey into the very heart of the wild. Survival in the jungle had begun with a single desperate act: drinking dirty water from a hollow log. But to truly live, not just exist, required a transformation far deeper than quenching a thirst. Marina had been shown the path by her unlikely saviors, the troop of Capuchin monkeys, but walking it meant shedding everything she had ever been. She had to stop being a lost little girl and learn the intricate, ancient art of being a monkey. This was not a conscious decision. It was a slow, instinctual process, a complete rewriting of her biological and behavioral programming, driven by the most powerful force in nature: the will to live. Her first and most urgent lesson was in the language of food. The gnawing hunger that had almost killed her was a constant, brutal teacher. She learned to become a shadow, an apprentice to the furry, four-legged masters of the forest. In the beginning, her strategy was simple and crude. She would wait until the troop had finished with a fruit tree or a patch of nuts, and then she would scramble to the ground to scavenge the leftovers. She would gather the discarded husks, the half-eaten pieces, the scraps that had been deemed unworthy. It was a humiliating but effective way to stay alive. But scavenging was not enough. To truly be part of their world, she had to learn to find food for herself. This meant becoming an observer of unparalleled focus. She would sit for hours, her small body still as stone, watching every move they made. She started to notice patterns. It wasn't just any fruit they ate. They would ignore the brightly colored, tempting berries that grew low to the ground, the same ones she had been tempted by in her first desperate days. Instead, they would climb high into the canopy to find specific types of figs or tough-skinned fruits that looked unappetizing to her human eyes. She learned that color could be a lie, a beautiful trap set by the jungle. The true test was the monkey's approval. If the older, more experienced members of the troop ate something, it was safe. If they avoided it, it was poison. This became her golden rule, a law of survival she followed without question. She learned to use her senses in a new way. She would watch a monkey pick a fruit, sniff it carefully, perhaps take a small, tentative bite, and then either devour it with gusto or toss it aside with a chatter of disgust. Marina began to mimic this. Before putting anything in her mouth, she would smell it. Her nose, once accustomed to the smells of a kitchen, became attuned to the subtle scents of the forest, the difference between the sweet perfume of a ripe fig and the bitter, chemical warning of a toxic plant. She learned that the jungle communicated not in words, but in smells, tastes, and textures. Her diet changed completely. She ate things that no human child would ever consider. She learned to dig for starchy roots with her bare hands, her fingernails becoming thick and hard like tiny shovels. She would watch the monkeys peel back the bark of certain trees to find juicy grubs and insects, and after overcoming her initial revulsion, she learned to do the same, finding a vital source of protein. She discovered a particular type of nut with a shell so hard it was impossible to open with her teeth. She watched as the monkeys would carry these nuts to a flat rock, and then use another, smaller rock to smash them open with surprising precision. It was a display of tool use, a spark of intelligence she immediately copied. Finding her own hammer and anvil rocks, she spent hours clumsily trying to crack the nuts, often smashing her fingers in the process. But when she finally succeeded, the reward of the rich, oily kernel inside was a taste of triumph, a sign that she was not just surviving but adapting. This new lifestyle began to physically reshape her. The soft, delicate body of a 4-year-old girl began to harden. Her feet, perpetually bare, became tough and leathery. The soles thickened into natural shoes, calloused and scarred, allowing her to walk over sharp rocks and thorny branches without flinching. Her hands underwent a similar transformation. From playing with dolls to constantly gripping branches, digging in the dirt, and pulling herself up trees, her palms became rough and calloused, her grip astonishingly strong. The physical evidence of her old life was being erased, replaced by the marks of her new one. The most dramatic change was in her mobility. When she first found the monkeys, she was a creature of the ground, clumsy and slow. She would watch with a sense of awe and envy as they moved through the canopy, a world of branches and vines high above her head. They flowed through the trees with a grace and confidence that seemed impossible. For them, the forest floor was a place of danger, a place where predators like jaguars lurked. The real safety, the real home, was in the treetops. If she was to stay with her new family, she had to learn to join them there. Her first attempts at climbing were disastrous. She would grab onto a low-hanging vine and try to pull herself up, only to have her arms give out, sending her tumbling back to the ground. She would try to scale the trunks of smaller trees, her bare feet slipping, her knees and elbows getting scraped and bruised. The monkeys would sometimes watch her clumsy efforts with what seemed like amusement, chattering from their high perches. But she was persistent. She watched their technique, how they used all 4 limbs in perfect coordination, how they judged the distance between branches with a flick of their tail for balance, how they used their momentum to swing from one hold to the next. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to learn. She started with smaller trees, building the strength in her arms and legs. Her muscles, once soft, became dense and powerful. She learned to find handholds and footholds in the rough bark, to trust her grip. The fear of falling, which had initially paralyzed her, began to recede, replaced by a growing confidence. Soon she could scramble up a small tree with surprising speed. Then she learned to move between them, making small, careful leaps from one sturdy branch to another. Her body learned a new kind of rhythm, a 4-limbed locomotion that was more animal than human. She began to move in a low crouch, even on the ground, a posture that kept her balanced and ready to spring into a climb at a moment's notice. Her physical form was adapting, her human anatomy being pushed to its primate limits. As she became more physically adept, she was able to spend more time in close proximity to the troop. She was no longer a weak creature struggling on the forest floor, but a capable companion who could keep up. This new intimacy brought her face to face with the next great challenge: communication. Her human language, the Spanish she had spoken in her old life, had already begun to fade. The words mama and papa had become hollow sounds, ghosts of a life that no longer had any relevance. In a world where no one understood them, the words withered and died from lack of use. The complex web of sounds in the jungle simply overwrote them. Her brain, plastic and adaptable, began to discard the useless information of her past and absorb the vital language of her present. She began to decipher the monkey's complex vocabulary of sounds. It was a language without nouns or verbs, a language of pure emotion and intent. She learned that a short, sharp bark was a general alert, a sign that something was amiss. A high-pitched, piercing shriek, however, was a specific alarm of mortal danger. The first time she heard that shriek, the entire troop exploded into action, scrambling to the highest, thinnest branches in a matter of seconds. She didn't know why, but she followed their lead, her heart pounding in her chest. From her high vantage point, she saw the reason for their panic. A sleek, spotted jaguar moving silently on the forest floor below. She had learned the word for danger in the most effective way possible. From then on, that sound triggered an immediate, instinctual response in her. She didn't think, she just climbed. She learned other sounds too. A low, rumbling chatter meant contentment, often heard when the troop was resting or grooming. A series of excited, high-pitched chirps meant a new source of food had been discovered, a signal that would bring the whole family running. There were squabbles, too loud, aggressive screams, and bared teeth over a prized piece of fruit or a favored resting spot. She learned to recognize the sounds of aggression and to make herself scarce when they erupted. But communication was more than just sound. It was a dance of body language. She learned to read the subtle cues in their posture. A relaxed, loose-limbed body meant safety. A tense, rigid stance with fur on end was a sign of fear or aggression. She learned that direct eye contact could be seen as a challenge. She learned to avert her gaze, to make herself appear non-threatening to the more dominant members of the troop. She learned to interpret the flick of a tail, the angle of a head, the slightest change in facial expression. In turn, she began to use this language herself. She couldn't replicate their calls perfectly, but she could manage her own version, a low grunt of contentment, a sharp cry of alarm. More importantly, she mastered the physical cues. She learned to crouch and make herself small to show submission. She learned to hold out a hand, palm up, as a gesture of peace or a request for food. She was no longer just listening to their conversations. She was participating in them. She was bridging the immense gap between species, not through human intellect, but through primate instinct. This newfound ability to communicate was the key that unlocked the final door. Social integration. For months, she had been an accepted observer, a tolerated anomaly. But as she mastered their way of life, her status began to change. She was no longer just the strange, hairless creature that followed them around. She was becoming a member of the family. The first sign of this profound shift was the act of grooming. Grooming for primates is not just about hygiene. It is the glue that holds their society together. It is an expression of trust, affection, and social bonds. One afternoon, as she was resting near the troop, a young female monkey cautiously approached her. Marina sat perfectly still, her heart thumping. The monkey reached out a delicate hand and began to pick through her long matted hair. It was a strange sensation, the light tugging and meticulous searching. The monkey was not being aggressive. It was treating her as it would any other member of the troop, searching for insects and dirt. It was a gesture of profound acceptance. Overwhelmed with a feeling she hadn't experienced since her abduct Iona sense of belonging. She began to cry, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. The monkey paused for a moment, then continued its gentle work. Later, she learned to reciprocate, to timidly groom the monkey's back, running her fingers through their fur. It was the most intimate connection she had made, a confirmation that she was truly one of them. She found a special kinship with the younger monkeys. Her human childhood had been stolen from her. But here, in the jungle, she found a new one. They would play together for hours, their games a chaotic mix of wrestling, chasing, and tumbling through the undergrowth. She would chase them up trees, and they would leap onto her back, chattering with excitement. These moments of play were pure joy, a language that needed no translation. In these games, she was not a human girl pretending to be a monkey. She was simply a young creature, full of life, playing with her friends. But monkey society was not all play and grooming. It had a strict unwritten code of conduct. She had to learn the hierarchy, a complex social ladder with a dominant male at the top. She learned quickly that the alpha male had first choice of food and the best resting spots. To challenge him was unthinkable. She learned her place, which was near the bottom of the social order. This lesson was sometimes taught harshly. Once she found a particularly large, sweet fruit and, forgetting the rules in her excitement, she began to eat it. A larger, more dominant monkey appeared, let out a terrifying scream, and slapped the fruit out of her hand before cuffing her on the side of the head. The blow was not hard enough to seriously injure her, but the message was clear. There were rules. There was an order to things. She had overstepped her bounds. It was a painful but necessary lesson in social etiquette. From that day on, she was more careful. She learned to wait her turn, to show deference to her superiors, to understand the intricate web of relationships that governed the troop. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a functioning member of a complex society. Her identity had been completely reshaped. In her own mind, the distinction between human and monkey had all but vanished. This troop was her family. This patch of jungle was her home. Her days were governed by the rhythm of their lives. Waking at dawn, foraging for food, playing, grooming, and sleeping together in a huddled pile in the safety of the trees at night. She had been cast out by her own species, left to die in the wilderness. But in a strange and beautiful twist of fate, the wilderness had taken her in, and a family of monkeys had taught her not just how to survive, but how to belong. For 5 years, the jungle was Marina's entire world. The canopy of leaves was her roof, the earth her floor, and the chattering of Capuchin monkeys was the only language she knew. Her human past was a collection of faded, dreamlike images, so distant they might have belonged to someone else. Her reality was the daily search for food, the simple joy of playing with her primate siblings, and the deep instinctual comfort of huddling together with her troop for warmth and safety at night. She was no longer a lost girl. She was a creature of the wild, perfectly adapted, her body and mind sculpted by the unforgiving but honest laws of the jungle. But this unique and isolated existence, this strange harmony between a human child and her monkey family, was never destined to last. The human world, which had violently cast her out, was about to violently reclaim her, and her rescue would prove to be a trauma far more complex and damaging than her abandonment. The end of her wild life came without warning. It arrived not with the roar of an engine or the kindness of a search party, but with the sudden sharp crackle of human voices and the rustle of bodies moving through the undergrowth in a way that was distinctly not animal. The monkeys, with their superior senses, heard it first. A sharp bark of alarm rippled through the troop, and in an instant, they vanished into the high canopy, their familiar forms disappearing behind a curtain of leaves. Marina, whose hearing was no longer as sharp as theirs, was a moment too slow to react. She had been on the ground, digging for roots, and by the time she registered the danger, it was too late. 2 men burst into the clearing. They were not the soft, gentle figures from her faded memories. These men were rough, their faces hard, their clothes ragged. They carried long knives and nets. They were hunters. When they saw her, they stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes wide with disbelief. Here, in the middle of nowhere, was a small, feral-looking child. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess. Her skin was tanned dark by the sun and covered in a layer of dirt and old scars. She was crouched on all fours, her knuckles resting on the ground, her movements more animal than human. She wore the tattered remnants of what might have once been a dress, but it was now little more than a rag. She stared back at them, her eyes wide with a fear she hadn't felt in years. These creatures were like her, yet completely alien. They smelled wrong. They moved wrong. They were a threat. Her first instinct was the one the jungle had taught her: flee. She turned and scrambled for the nearest tree, her tough, bare feet finding purchase on the bark. But she was not as fast as her monkey family. One of the men lunged, his hand grabbing a fistful of her matted hair and yanking her back with a painful jolt. She screamed, a raw, guttural shriek of terror, not a human word, but the alarm call of a Capuchin monkey. The sound only seemed to amuse the men. They laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made her skin crawl. They spoke to her in the language of her forgotten past, but the words were just meaningless noise. She fought back with the ferocity of a trapped animal, kicking, scratching, and trying to bite the hands that held her. But she was just a small child, and their strength was overwhelming. They subdued her, tied her hands with a rough piece of rope, and dragged her away from the only home she could remember. As they pulled her through the forest, she looked back one last time, hoping to see her monkey family, but the trees were silent. They had gone. She was alone again. Her re-entry into the human world was not a rescue. It was a second kidnapping. The hunters did not take her to a police station or a village to find her family. To them, she was not a lost child to be saved. She was a commodity, a strange and valuable find to be sold. They led her on a long, grueling journey, finally arriving at a bustling, chaotic city that assaulted her senses. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of engines, shouting voices, and blaring music. The smells were overwhelming, a sickening mix of rotting garbage, cooking food, and unwashed bodies. After the clean, organic scents of the jungle, it was a physical assault. The sheer number of people, a sea of strange faces, was terrifying. She had lived in a small, tight-knit family of about 20. Now she was surrounded by thousands of loud, unpredictable creatures. She was overwhelmed, terrified, and completely shut down. The hunters took her to a brothel, a dark and squalid house filled with sad-eyed women and cruel-faced men. They sold her to the woman who ran the place, a woman with a hard face and a colder heart. Here a new kind of nightmare began. She was given a new name, treated not as a child but as a slave. She was expected to clean, to scrub floors, to run errands, to obey every command without question. But she couldn't understand them. The Spanish words they barked at her were just noise. Her failure to comprehend their commands was met not with patience, but with violence. She was beaten for not understanding, for being too slow, for her strange, animal-like habits. The human world, she quickly learned, was a place of arbitrary rules and casual cruelty, a stark contrast to the clear, honest laws of the jungle. In the jungle, a slap from a dominant monkey was a quick, sharp lesson in social order. Here the beatings were relentless, born of frustration and malice. Her body, which had become so strong and capable in the wild, was now a prison. She would instinctively crouch on her haunches instead of sitting on a chair, earning her a slap. She would try to eat her food with her hands, snatching it quickly, earning her another. She was forced to wear shoes which felt like tiny, suffocating cages on her tough, leathery feet. She was bathed, and the thick layer of dirt that had served as a natural protection against insects and the sun was scrubbed away, leaving her skin feeling raw and vulnerable. They cut her long, matted hair, and she felt a sense of loss, as if a part of her identity had been shorn away. They were trying to force her back into the shape of a human child, but they were doing it with brute force, chipping away at her wild self without any understanding or compassion. For what felt like an eternity, she lived in this state of terror and confusion, but the survival instincts honed in the jungle had not deserted her. She learned to be a keen observer once again, not of monkeys but of humans. She learned to anticipate the moods of her captors, to make herself small and invisible to avoid their wrath. And with the help of another young girl who was also a captive in the house, she planned her escape. One night, when the house was quiet, they managed to unbar a window and slip out into the darkness. They ran, their bare feet pounding on the hard, unfamiliar pavement, until the terrible house was far behind them. Freedom, however, was not a return to a safe home. It was merely an exchange of one type of prison for another. Marina was now a street child, one of the countless homeless, forgotten children who lived in the city's slums. She joined a small ragtag gang of other orphans, and a new, grimmer chapter of survival began. Life on the streets was, in some ways, even more brutal than the jungle. The human world had its own predators, its own unforgiving hierarchy. She learned to steal food to survive, to fight for scraps, to sleep in doorways and abandoned buildings, always on alert. But even here, in the depths of human misery, the lessons of the jungle served her well. She was quicker, more agile, and more aware of her surroundings than the other children. Her ability to climb gave her an advantage, allowing her to reach high windows or escape from danger by scaling walls and rooftops. She was still a feral child, applying the rules of the primate world to the concrete jungle of the city. It was during this time that the slow, painful process of becoming human again truly began. Surrounded by other children, she started to pick up the language. It came back to her in fragments, at first single words, simple phrases. The other children, in their own rough way, became her teachers. They taught her the names for things, the words for food, water, danger, run. Her brain, which had so completely adopted the language of the Capuchins, began to rewire itself once more, slowly rebuilding the neural pathways for human speech. It was a clumsy, difficult process. Her tongue felt thick and awkward, forming the strange sounds, and for a long time, her speech was a bizarre mix of broken Spanish and monkey-like clicks and chirps. Even as language returned, the echoes of her jungle life remained deeply embedded in her behavior. These were not conscious choices. They were deep, instinctual habits that she couldn't simply turn off. She preferred to eat her food directly off her plate or even the floor, finding tables and cutlery to be awkward and unnecessary. When she was scared or startled, her first impulse was not to scream for help, but to climb the nearest vertical surface wall, a lamppost, a tree. She couldn't sleep in a bed. The softness and confinement felt unnatural and dangerous. She preferred the hard floor, curled up in a corner where she could see all the entrances to the room. Her social interactions were also strange. She had no concept of personal space and would often groom her new friends, picking through their hair, a gesture of affection that the other street children found bizarre but eventually came to accept as just one of her many quirks. These lasting behavioral traits were a living testament to the power of her early imprinting, powerful evidence of how her environment had fundamentally shaped her very being. Her life took another dramatic turn when, at around the age of 14, she was rescued from the streets, this time for good. A kind and compassionate family, the Chapmans, took her in. This was her first real experience of human kindness since her abduction. They didn't try to beat the wildness out of her. They showed her patience, love, and understanding. They gave her a home, a real home, and slowly, gently, they began to teach her how to live in their world. It was a long and arduous journey. She had to learn everything from scratch. How to use a knife and fork, how to flush a toilet, how to sleep in a bed, how to read and write. Every day was filled with challenges, with moments of frustration and confusion. But for the first time she was safe. Years passed. Marina grew into a woman, got married, and had children of her own. She moved to England, building a life that was a world away from the Colombian jungle. To the outside observer, she might have seemed like any other woman. But the scars of her two worlds remained. The story she carried within her was so extraordinary that for many years, she kept it to herself, afraid no one would believe her. When she finally did decide to tell her story, publishing a book with the help of her daughter, it was met with a mix of fascination and skepticism. How could this be real? Could a human child really be raised by monkeys? The question of authenticity has followed her ever since. Some scientists and experts have expressed doubts. suggesting that her memories could be the product of childhood trauma and a vivid imagination, a story her mind created to cope with the horror of being abandoned. They point to the lack of hard physical evidence, the impossibility of ever truly verifying the events that took place in that remote jungle so many years ago. It is, they argue, a compelling narrative, but perhaps just theta narrative. However, the evidence in her favor is powerful and persuasive. Those who have studied her case, including biologists and primatologists, have been struck by her incredibly detailed and accurate knowledge of Capuchin monkey behavior. She describes their social structures, their dietary habits, their specific alarm calls, and their methods of tool use with a level of detail that would be nearly impossible to fabricate without first-hand experience. She knew things about capuchins that were not widely documented in scientific literature at the time she came out of the jungle. Furthermore, her own body tells the story. Even as an adult, she retained a remarkable physical agility, an ability to climb with a primate-like ease that astonishes onlookers. Medical examinations have noted her incredibly strong bone density, consistent with a life of strenuous physical activity from a very young age. And then there is the consistency of her story itself. Over decades, through countless interviews and retellings, the core details of her account have never wavered. Her emotional responses when recounting certain events, the terror of her abduction, the profound sense of belonging when she was first groomed by a monkey, have the unmistakable ring of authentic, lived-in trauma and experience. Ultimately, the story of Marina Chapman exists in that fascinating gray area between documented fact and unbelievable legend. But whether every single detail can be scientifically proven is, in some ways, beside the point. Her life stands as a profound and unique case study in human resilience and adaptability. She is a living example of how incredibly plastic our brains and bodies are. How a young child, faced with impossible circumstances, can have their very identity overwritten by their environment. Her journey from a human child to a member of a monkey troop, and then back again to a human woman, is a powerful, haunting reminder that the line between human and animal, between civilization and the wild, is far thinner and more fragile than we might ever dare to imagine. Her scars, both visible and invisible, are a map of that journey, a testament to the two worlds that claimed her, and the incredible strength it took to survive them both. Marina Chapman's life is a stark reminder that the rules of civilization can disappear in an instant. Her story bridges the gap between scientific curiosity and forgotten human experiences. It shows that when faced with the impossible, the human body and mind can adapt in ways we are only beginning to understand, leaving us with a profound mystery about our own fundamental nature. If the past still whispers to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Ancient Relics Keeper, because some mysteries were never meant to be buried.